Hello, everyone. Um, Today, I'd like to really make a presentation about the evolution of museum architecture and also to look at the emerging museum architecture that's happening in the 21st century, but also specifically how it's going to impact the continent of Africa. Our traditional beliefs about museum collecting really comes from the rebirth of interest in the Renaissance. Of the classical world and the beginning of casts and reconstructions of Greek sculpture that was being kind of brought together by Roman collectors and Roman families to dignify their homes and their spaces, right through to the idea of imagery. I love this image as a kind of way to kind of bring that conversation into the fore. And of course, with this, in sort of during the Enlightenment, the notion of collecting and of being worldly and being able to understand the natural world as well as the anthropological and archaeological world became incredibly important. And the best sort of spaces for that had that data and that information really started to surge in their knowledge and their ability to have this knowledge and to disseminate it amongst their people and their populations. Of course, this moved as wealth built in the West into the sort of Renaissance in the visual arts and the performing arts, all the arts, in fact. And right up to the sort of 18th century, we're then looking at an explosion of representation, which then fills palaces and churches and extraordinary spaces, and becomes a kind of salon style to deal with the sheer quantities of these works in these private institutions. Of course, probably at the beginning in the 19th century, the sort of first real museum exhibition is probably the Great Exhibition in 1851, where a purpose-built structure is made to really create a public forum, a real, truly public space that creates the assemblages mostly of colonial conquest and empire, and of technological advancement and of wealth. So it's a kind of moment of the sort of empires and the colonial empires bringing their population and their citizens along with them on this new sort of unfolding power in the world and the dominance of their cultures in the world. At the same time that these expositions are happening, this is the reverse image where sacred shrines in places, we will go to West Africa now, like Benin, where these incredible sacred shrines are the Kingdom of Benin is being taken down for its audacity to stand up to the British Empire. And the artifacts of these palaces and these homes are then being taken back to be shown to civilizations in the West. These artifacts, which move from sacred shrines, then begin to adorn people's houses and homes and become sort of trophy forms, decontextualized and also decontextualized from their environment, but also decontextualized from their histories, and become just objects of curiosity, which then start to become ornaments in museums, in homes, in places. In museums, the sort of encyclopedic quality, the archival quality of just simply indexing and reducing the detail and the specificity of these materials becomes even more exacerbated, and they're just indexed as almost archaeological found objects, just describing their scientific provenance, but not their contextual and spiritual or sociological context. This extraction in relation to the continent is something that I want you to reflect on, because in a sense, as the evolution of the museum from the model of the Crystal Palace becomes more and more refined, more and more decluttered from the sort of palaces of the 18th century, and moves into the 19th and early 20th century with sort of abstract spaces, the modernist movement bringing abstraction and whitening of the gallery, less objects being placed in, more rooms being required, new palaces of museums being required to absorb and understand the works, the Modernist Museum, which is also a reflection on the artifacts of the times past, still incubate this analysis to the point that at the end of the 20th century, we have a kind of seminal work by Martin-Roth-Symposium where he talks about the lights going on and off in the white cube as the kind of endpoint of this decluttering or this essentializing of the museum to the point that the space itself becomes the object of conversation. And for me, the counterpoint, which is Kara Walker's extraordinary work in The Domino Factory, where she moves out of the space of the white cube and enters the space of an industrial labor space as a kind of reclamation of the relevance of art within society and the relevance of art within the social infrastructure of the communities now, or specifically in this, a dying labor community in Brooklyn, which is no longer a factory, but will become a sort of residential unit. For me, this moment really speaks to the rise really of the museum that we built on the National Museum of African American History and Culture, this museum which was built on the Washington Mall, which takes a new model entirely. The model is to create a narrative museum which starts to recontextualize not just the objects of some of the colonial tropes or endeavors, but also of slavery specifically and the formation of America specifically, and to use the building and its interiors to curate a narrative museum which starts to allow people to kind of find the sense of themselves within the big project of the formation of nation building, the formation of the world that we live in now in the 21st century. This museum finishes a kind of run of really very much 19th century inspired museums and creates at a counterpoint a new 21st century museum which speaks as a teaching beacon and a tool for the democratization of information in the 21st century with the birth of the digitization and the internet, but also with the shift away from the value of the object as authentic to the recording of experience and the objects that make the experience further enhanced emotionally to be of value. And right now, the projects that we're working on bring us back to that moment, that image of the sort of British shoulders sort of extracting out of Benin, out of Nigeria in the top corner, the orange being the sort of the British relationship to the continent of Africa pre the Berlin division. And the ideas of Benin City, an extraordinary world monument, which is now recognized as a World Heritage City, if we could have seen it, with an extraordinary network of walls, which created a complex idea of how a city organization could work. Our thinking is in this context to try and see if we can construct the notion of the museum as a reteaching tool of the lost stories of the colonial extraction that created the museums in the West, but excavated the knowledge base of the cultures of West Africa or the colonies from their communities. Here's looking at a diagram where we are looking at the restoration of the walls, the restoration of the spaces in front of the palace grounds, the definition and the identification of that, to then place within that an idea of making a construction, making a new type of museum where it's not about the spoils, but about reconstructing memory. It starts with looking at some of the royal enclosures and the drawings of soldiers of how the city looked with its extraordinary orthogonal walls and its courtyard networks. It looks at some of the visual photography which was taken and the ruins which are now of these spaces without their artifacts and without their communities, lost from their context. And to see if we can create a new kind of museum where the notion of the spaces of the inhabitation of these forms are then reconstructed as pavilions that allow the recontextualizing of these artifacts now that we're in discussion about restitution or reconstructions that can allow the communities that are in Africa to understand their heritage, and that becoming a model of 21st century architecture on the continent. And also as a way to create a relationship between the extraction that has happened in the West to those museums, and to understand a new model of museum building, which is required on the continent and elsewhere that is outside of the context of the Western model. So these are really thinking about the idea of the museum as a place of reconstruction and a place of remaking memory, lost collective memories. So these are just images of the proposition of the Benin Museum, and then immediately one might believe that this is a traditional museum, but this is looking at the restitution and the objectification that happens in the West, and then full reconstruction where artifacts are replaced within context and storytelling enacted to re-allow the citizens and also visitors to understand the magnitude and the importance of these civilizations and the context of these objects which have been decontextualized. The notion of gardens, which are symbolic, and the notion of the form of the building being made from the matter that is referencing the walls of the city and the construction types of the cities, and the relationship of this institution back in the royal compound and how it could make a relationship to the city and to the community that will receive this eventually. Thank you.
You